Look who's here, everybody. Oh, and now the super chats come rolling in. So let's... Robert, the first thing I want to do is say thank you for doing this live stream. And there are a lot of people who already follow this channel who know exactly who you are. I did give people a brief rundown looking at your website, but I was wondering if, in your own words, if you could explain the cases that you like, how you choose the cases that you decide to take, because you're a really busy guy. You've had some really high profile clients. I'm sure you have a lot of people asking for your time. How do you choose the cases, and what's your philosophy behind that?
Sure. So basically, I'm in a position currently. When I started out, I was just trying to learn legal practice. So I worked for every kind of thing you could do. So I worked for a Native American tribe that was starting its own court system, worked for a corporate law firm, worked for personal injury lawyers, then started out worked for a small startup public interest practice, worked for a street lawyer, took in everything off the street, worked for one of the top plaintiffs lawyers in the country. That was right out of King of Torts from John Grisham's novel, and then went to work with a boutique law firm that was a buddy of mine that we'd gone to law school together, and then started my own practice about a decade ago, and was successful in certain areas that afforded me the opportunity to be flexible in what cases I took and what clients I took. And since then, basically about half of my practice is either pro bono or contingency fee cases. I think some of you who work for me think that number is probably getting a little high, but it is what it is. But basically, I look for underdog cases, so that I do civil cases, criminal cases, constitutional cases, all kinds of cases, all across the country, even cases internationally, where I'm brought in for various particular purposes, extradition in some context, other things, fraud recovery in other cases. But what they all thematically have in common, and what I look for, is they're underdog cases. There are people that my client, even if they're wealthy themselves, who they're up against makes them the underdog. So if you're Wesley Snipes and you're up against the U.S. government, you're an underdog. So they're all underdog cases. Those are the ones I liked. I grew up on The Equalizer as a kid and wanted to create a legal practice that ideally could emulate that.
Okay, so I have to ask you then, in relation to that, how Trump fits into the underdog case philosophy, because you did represent him, right? Yes. Okay, in the election stuff. And I do think, if anyone who wants to say I only talk to one kind of person, you are now I don't know if you're the second or third constitutional attorney I've had on, but one of the other ones referenced Hitler in talking about Trump and saying that he read Mein Kampf all the time, and you represented him. So no one can say that I have only one kind of Trump, thought or ideology on this channel. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, a lot of people might say, come on, like, Trump is the underdog, and I want you to talk not just about that, but I will say, and this is before we get into the Parler stuff, because that's what I want to talk about next, and the big tech thing. When I would watch you and VIVA have your live streams about that during the whole post-election mess, and then I would watch mainstream news, and even some of the YouTubers that were talking about this, I was completely confused, and I realized, you know what? I just don't know. Like, I literally don't know. And I remember seeing Scott Adams in one of his morning live streams saying, anyone who's like at my level, just kind of the person just turning on the news or watching YouTube, we don't have any insider information, who's like, I know for sure 100% this, or I know for sure 100% that is really not an honest or authentic position to take. Because at this point, those of us who are just kind of on the outside looking in, it's really hard to know how to know anything at that level of government and, intelligence and we'll get into the big tech side of it. But to go back to the original question, love for you to just talk about that experience of yours.
Sure. So in the election context, I've represented people all across the political spectrum. So there was someone doing a documentary on the Covington kids, and they were getting pushback because I'd represented Alex Jones. And I was like, well, it's a guarantee that people are going to hate someone that I've represented, because I've represented people who hate one another. So I represented the Green Party, Peace and Freedom Party, last socialist party in America, represented Libertarian Party, Tea Party, Taxpayers Party, Constitution Party, the New Green Party, the Independent Green Party. There's like multiple variations of them. Jill Stein, Ralph Nader, Wesley Snipes, and Donald Trump and Alex Jones. So what they all have in common in my case is that they're underdogs. And the way they are in Trump's case, Trump was going up against what Time Magazine bragged about, an elite group of Chamber of Commerce, labor unions, political insiders, people from both parties, major newspapers, major media organizations that all wanted to see him lose. And they called it election fortification. Some folks would use a different F word to associate with it. So, some more crude, some more technical. But so when he reached out to me, it was because his corporate insider lawyers were basically conflicted. Many of them represented some of the election officials that Trump would be suing or legally challenging or politically contesting. Many of them had not disclosed that fact until very late. Or he had what I call sort of crazy outsiders, people that are so far outside the system that they're not connected or tethered to functional reality, many of whom had no experience at all in election law. And it was this unusual space where the number of lawyers who do election law is very small, and almost all of them are partisan. They're either corporate insiders or government connected, disproportionately on the Democratic side of the aisle. I was one of the only ones that had represented people across the spectrum. And so people who knew me talked to him, and he reached out to me. And my pitch was a very simple one, that, the real question is, was the election constitutionally conforming or not? The narrative of was there fraud or not, I always thought it was a misnomer, because that's not how our election laws are designed. It's was the vote valid or not valid? And in this context, did only constitutionally qualified voters vote? Did they only cast a ballot in a constitutionally qualified manner? And was a vote canvassed and counted in a constitutionally conforming manner? And we have good standards for that. United States Election Assistance Commission set that up. So what I told him was, if they allow you to do a signature match check, a party observer signature match check, a well-recognized election standard by the OECD, by the United States Election Assistance Commission, by a wide range of independent, nonpartisan people, including the Carter-Baker Commission of 2005, then the election was probably on the up and up. If, on the other hand, they won't let any party observers check the signatures, then they fear at least that there's a systemic problem in the elections. And he said, okay, go ahead, get involved to see what you can find. And everybody stalled. Nobody, in fact, to this day, no state has allowed any party observer signature match check to occur in any of the contested states, which I find striking. They won't even publish the ballots, even though they're all digitized. So in that context, given who was on the opposite side, who time described as being on the opposite side, even Donald J. Trump was the underdog.
All right, I want to bring our attention to Parler real fast, and I'm going to show a website that I showed people a little bit earlier, but in case folks have just tuned in. So this is from Zero Hedge, and it's an article, Parler just flipped big tech's January 6th conspiracy theory on its head, and basically talks about how not only has Parler revealed that it had opened up a line of communication with the FBI and alerted them about possibilities of an attack on the Capitol, but also that of the 270 charging documents filed by the DOJ, that 80% of the social media references involved the other platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and only 5% referenced Parler, and yet Parler is the one that ends up getting booted from these like Amazon and Apple, and gets maligned by mainstream media, and then the government's coming after them. What do you make of that? Because to me that just screams, as I titled the live stream, is the government pressuring or colluding with big tech, and it just starts to look like these lines are really blurring, especially when you see that if these other bigger companies were a bigger issue, why was all the focus on this new competition?
No doubt about it. I mean, I think the best litigation on this in an analogous context is Robert Kennedy has brought suit on behalf of I'm always getting it wrong. It's either the Children's Health Defense or the Children's Defense Fund. I get it confused with that old lefty social welfare organization. But
Children's Health Defense, I believe, because I had them on
it is Children's Health Defense. I got to remember that. But he's brought suit challenging whether Facebook was censoring them based on orders from government officials and in cahoots with government officials. And at some level, people don't know this often, but there is, when you act at the behest or the behalf of the government, then in fact you can be sued as a government agent responsible under the First Amendment. We'll see how that litigation progresses and whether it gets past a motion to dismiss. But that was the first indicators that there was being aggressive, collusive efforts between government agencies putting pressure on big tech to censor, to do what the government itself cannot do. And so I think it's accelerated. I mean, I think a lot of these congressional hearings, since 2016 especially, have been used as threats. Even some of the antitrust threats coming from Senator Warren's camp have been used to suggest that, hey, maybe if you censor who we want censored, then maybe we'll back off some of our antitrust threats. And so then of course there's all these congressional committee hearings where all they do is lecture about how there needs to be more censorship. And that really started after 2016 because they focused on Russian bots and Russian infiltration. When the actual evidence, kind of similar to Parler, it turned out that the only Russian trolling effort was by a Russian private entity that was doing it on both the left and the right that had almost zero influence on the election. I mean, they were talking about Facebook posts that got like 5 likes, and somehow that was what shaped the election outcome. But the media ran with that narrative as well and was sort of in cahoots with them. And I think that what we see with Parler is a selective targeting that the court, the Western District of Washington, sort of affirmed by saying, look at how horrible Parler uniquely is. It's okay for Amazon to do what they did, when in fact Parler was a very, very minor player, and if anything, was more aggressive at reporting these risks than Twitter or Facebook or other big tech engines were.
Okay, a couple other headlines I'm going to read you because I'd like your thoughts on this, and this is kind of apropos to what we're just talking about. So this one's from Reuters. This is March 2nd, 2016. Former Google CEO Schmidt to head new Pentagon Innovation Board. So you just see them moving from tech to, the federal government. And then I was hearing about Election Guard today. Actually had not heard about it before, but was listening to Tim Dillon, who I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a comedian. I think he used to sell subprime mortgages, and he's a comedian, but he was interviewing Whitney Webb. And it just goes to show how much faith I have in my old industry of mainstream media that I go to a comedian for my news now. But it was actually a very good interview, and I recommend that everybody go check it out. But she was talking about Election Guard, and it's a Microsoft product. Microsoft wins hotly contested $10 billion defense contract, beating out Amazon. So you just go, it makes your mind want to, well, if you're me, that's why you move further and further out into the middle of nowhere. And you don't want to be in one of these smart cities, which I want to ask you about a little bit later. But I guess, what do you make of, is it conspiracy theory or is it just rational thinking if you're looking at this and you're like, what is going on here? You get the tech companies and the defense. Are they defense contractors at this point? Are they part of the intelligence state? Like, what is going on here, or is that just Allison going off the deep end?
Well, there's definitely a big tech industrial complex that in many cases is supplanting and even to some degree replacing the military industrial complex. I'll give 2 examples of this. What ultimately led to Microsoft being targeted by the antitrust division is Microsoft and Bill Gates antagonized the Defense Department. Because I was in the software tech space while I was in college, helping a new company develop products, and was out there and met with some military people as this part of this process, because it turned out like the emir, some Mideast emirs wanted our product. The whole long story, but they were complaining about Bill Gates and Microsoft because Microsoft had apparently started to develop a monopoly on certain products within the Defense Department and had built in a back door that he hadn't fully disclosed to the Pentagon. And that led to him being persona non grata and ultimately greenlit the antitrust actions against him. But since then, they've gone further and further into bed with each other. And an example of this is a second story is the Shirley Atkinson story. It's just a sub-constituent component of it, which is the officers assigned to go after her were connected to the Silk Road group, was one group. One of them ended up in prison, but Silk Road is all about the dark web. And one of them was stealing Bitcoin, using the criminal investigation to do it under the Ross Ulbricht case. And then one of the other key people involved would be one of the top Mueller people who helped the illicit spying on Cheryl Atkinson, then leaves high-level FBI employment and goes to work as a key person at CrowdStrike, who becomes integral in the Russiagate story and the Hillary Clinton DNC email stories with all kinds of questionable behavior by CrowdStrike. So at what point and in that case, the FBI, why did the FBI defer to CrowdStrike at looking at whether someone actually hacked the DNC service or not? Because the person at CrowdStrike was their boss just a few years before. And so you're seeing this incredible revolving door between big tech. For example, Peter Thiel, people might have noticed, has gone very quiet the last several years. And that may relate to his Palantir company now taking over a lot of IRS and other high-profile Pentagon activities. He doesn't want to be involved in politics anymore in ways that could jeopardize his governmental contracts. So there's a deep relationship. And then, of course, you go all the way back to DARPA and the internet. And there's long been suspicions that CIA front companies were some of the initial seed money for a lot of key big tech industry. I mean, clearly the Chinese believe that. The Chinese think even Elon is up to it. They think with it that they're not going to allow their government employees to drive Tesla cars because they think he's gathering intel and information from his cars to feed back to spies in the United States and the West. So there is definitely, I don't think Musk is that far deep in, but many of the others, deep ties, and they're so overlapping. I mean, so many of the key Obama people towards the end were all Google people. That's happening now again with Biden. Many of the corporate lawyers being put in at the Justice Department to deal with antitrust in other areas, they were lawyers for big tech over the past 8 years. So you make money, you go, you help pay off that money they pay you by what you do in the government. Then you get paid off again when you leave government. And so it's even worse in many respects than the military-industrial complex ever got, because of the degree to which it's not fully recognized, and the scale of their powers, frankly, goes beyond. It's not just contracts to support wars or anything else. It's contracts to control populations writ large.
It's really interesting because there is a level, as you brought up, of again going back to intention and level of knowledge and all this stuff. And as an environmental reporter, I started to see how, because originally I think I have sort of that John Stossel background where you think you're doing an investigation, you get the government to come in, it slaps a regulation on the table, and everything's going to be fine. And you just do that a couple times and you've saved the world and you're done. You can go home with your Emmy and cuddle with them and be warm at night. And then you start realizing that actually sometimes those regulations, if not a lot of the time, if somebody's not paying attention to them on a regular basis, start to help the people that can either skirt them and they're not enforced for the people who just can get around them and cut corners, or to just totally ignored, I guess, by the elites, the people that have the attorneys or have the money or have the influence to get around them. And then the little guy ends up becoming either, they can't fight the system, so they just become totally defunct. Or they end up suffering the consequences that other people just don't have to. It just made me realize more and more, going back to my roots, that the thing you think of that's been protecting you and objectively protecting you, like you start to realize more and more that part of the problem is that, and let's kind of go back to the regulation thing, is that who are the regulations written for? That was what I started to see. Even if you were somebody who you're thinking that you're voting in a person that's got the little people, at heart and wants to make sure that they're taken care of, eventually even those people you can see slowly starting to creep into that era, the area of the room where it's like, wait a second, what did they just say at that cocktail party that we all heard about? And who do they know? And then it's not so easy as just somebody is, because it would be much easier if it was all like Watergate, for instance. But a lot of times, one of my favorite quotes from the movie about the Boston, was it the Boston Herald, I think, or the Boston Globe, the movie about breaking the Catholic sex scandal, the molestation scandal. I don't know if did you ever see that movie?
I did.
Okay, so there's like this scene where Michael Keaton and this other guy, so Michael Keaton's one of the reporters, and they're basically, he's being told not to run the story, and it's by a lawyer, I think, for the Catholic Church. And they all know each other because they all are Catholic and they all go to the same golf clubs and they all go to the same cocktail parties. And the attorney says to him, you really shouldn't do this. You're screwing your career, you're screwing your family, this is going to ruin all your friendships. And Michael Keaton goes, is that how this works? Just one guy leans over to another guy at a cocktail party or at a bar and says, don't do this. And that's how history happens. And so I think it's like, there's a whole spectrum of that. There's the beginning part where it's something like that, or it goes all the way to the point where it's intentional. And like you said, like it goes all the way up to the top. And for those of us on the outside to even know what's happening, even in the middle of that, but definitely not at the top, it's very it's a little depressing. I will say I've been kind of on, as somebody who thought she knew a little bit because I was a journalist, and now I guess I just know at least what I don't know, and now I'm on the process of relearning all of that and trying to build it back up from the bottom. So anyway, I appreciate your thoughts on that, and I guess to move on to specifically when I was talking about Tim Dillon and Whitney Webb, and what she was talking about was how perhaps all of this is moving us towards cities or communities where just data is being mined, and like her theory, and maybe it's not just her theory, it's just out there, is that we're kind of in this tech arms race with China, and so our government's trying to get as much data as we possibly can so that we win this tech arms race. And to do that, we have to figure out ways to monitor people, whether that's through your Fitbit or through your GPS on your phone or your Alexa or whatever else. And that they're pushing this idea of we should all be living in smart cities and innovation zones and stuff, because it's just going to be easier for us. It's going to be more fun. It's going to take the pressure off of us to be thinking individuals who have to pay for things, because now everything's free and it's awesome. Do you find credence to that, or do you think that's a little overboard?
No, I mean, I think that what you have is the problem of regulatory capture, which is, is my old debate with my old client, Ralph Nader, which, Ralph was sort of shocked in the 90s as he saw the scope and scale of it. He convinced himself that it was, Reaganite republicanism and the rest was why these agencies were fraying during the 80s. And then he saw under the Clinton administration, it got much, much worse. I was actually a young intern for the AFL-CIO, and we got to go to these meetings. I got to sit in on all these things, and it was fascinating to watch what motivated people, what didn't. And that even the Clinton administration was overwhelmingly corporatist in mindset. And these agencies were mostly deferential to whatever the biggest companies they were regulating wanted. And it also goes back to the Huey Long debate with the administrative state back to the 1930s, where he was like, FDR's agencies, the ABC agency and the XYZ agency, they want to tell you how many chickens you can have and how fat your cows can get and so on and so forth. And he would sort of ridicule and rip it through because it wasn't what the populist sentiment, even though that was more on the left, wanted. But it was part of the new regulatory state. And ultimately, my argument with Nader was it's inherent in the nature of the administrative state to be captured by the most powerful sources in society. That's who's going to place those people. That's who's going to fund think tanks that locate them for future administrative governmental service. That's who's going to influence the biggest institutional media. That's who's going to control a lot of who gets appointed to courts. And that's who's going to employ those administrators when they leave. And so to really cash in. And so it's going to be the rare instance that you're going to have someone in the regulatory state really trying to weaponize the broader power of the people through the state against these concentrated sources of economic and social and cultural influence. And that's been a problem all the way through. And big tech's just been one illustration and one example of it, but by no means the only example of it. And it's going to continue to be a problem. And I think that Whitney's right. I've been saying for years, some other people have been saying for years, that increasingly a lot of big tech looks to China as the model, that the Chinese social credit system, the Chinese mass surveillance system, it will be done in the name of everybody's health. Mm-hmm. And, something like a vaccine chip in somebody's, they're already developing the technology for this, quantum tattoos. Bill Gates is big on all of it. He even has somehow you need a chip in you that can be activated by remote control. And Gates had this long explanation as to why that was good. And I was like, why do I need a remote control for something that's in my own arm? So maybe that's somebody else who wants to use that. So we're entering the era of Bond villains coming to life right in front of us. And I think that the concerns, if anything, are understated rather than exaggerated.
So somebody asked if we could work in Steven Crowder being canceled today. Are you familiar with what happened?
Yes. Yeah. They effectively demonetized him, I think, forever.
On YouTube?
And then Yeah. And then they suspended him, though he knew a lot of that was coming, and they suspended him for a week. Now, what I'm curious about all this is where it's a little bit contrarian to the state. It's more along the Chinese model, but the original objective of a lot of these big tech was mass surveillance. That's not going to happen if they keep kicking people off so that nobody comes to use them, or that large portions of the population. Now, I think that will relate back to our conversation about Parler. They want to force people to stay in these gulags where they control what information they're allowed to see. And they're assuming that people just won't be able to leave and find places. That's why I think locals is one of the best alternatives to these big tech people. And Dave Rubin did a fantastic job with how he helped make them as independent and as protected as possible. But that's another for later on. But there's no question that they sort of want these kind of controlled, because here's Crowder is one of the most popular people driving people to YouTube in the first place. And it's like, okay, if you take him off, there's going to be people that never come back to YouTube, that go and find the either they go direct. Tim Pool's developing his own channel as well on his own website as well. I don't think Trump's idea is the best, but we'll see if that translates into anything. I think he may be, some people may be trying to grift him, but at a minimum level, he's definitely going to get involved in monetizing and marketing other alternative platforms, even if he doesn't create his own ultimately. But I think it's striking to me because of how big Crowder is. So now, I mean, when I told people all the way back that Alex Jones was the template and that people not paying attention just because of the controversy surrounding Alex Jones weren't, no, the system never starts out with the most popular person to target. I mean, that's why in the web space, they started out with CP because that's universally hated. But it became the excuse for government spying, government surveillance, government regulation. Then you proceed to terrorism. Then they just kept going further and further and further. As even Joe Rogan recognized that the line just keeps moving. Because once they cross the Rubicon of censorship and suppression in the first place, of memory holding, I mean, that's Alex Jones was bombarded all at the same time. How are these people not colluding? How is it that you see somebody files a lawsuit, the court issues a ruling, and within a day, all the big media networks, social media networks, ban Alex Jones overnight, ban everything to do with him. I mean, Facebook, you can't even say his name now, or you could be subject to being banned for just saying his name. So I think that it's going to continue to accelerate. That's why the decision you made, I think, is a decision I've been telling people to make for years now. I know Viva's hopeful. God, he's idealistic. He's a hopeless Canadian in his idealism. But I don't think there's a future on social media for alternative independent voices, regardless of whether they're right or left. I mean, Jimmy Dore, at some point, will be gone from YouTube. There will be others as well because they want an institutional narrative, what Michael Malice and others call the cathedral. They want that controlled narrative, and they want that, or what Eric Weinstein calls the gated institutional narrative. Nobody's supposed to come inside those gates, and they don't want anyone to leave once they're inside the gates either. They just want to limit what you can hear and what you can say. And it's going to accelerate. It's not going to back down. It's going to look more like China than it's going to look like 1990s America.
Ryan Christian, the last American Vagabond, I had him on the channel a couple of times. He would not consider himself a conservative, and he's now on his third YouTube channel. So that just goes to show. Yes. So Stephen asks, what evidence are you aware of or have collected on your local site supporting the contention that there is actual concrete evidence of election fraud in the 2020 election? And I do want to also add that another thing that I heard Whitney say was that often people were talking about voter fraud when it really should have been framed as election fraud, and that there have been irregularities and inconsistencies that have dated back maybe even decades, but it seems like both parties are okay with it because they're aware of it. Tulsi Gabbard proposed a bill that never went anywhere, and is it just that they complain if it's not their person who benefits from it? Is that how it works? I guess so. Maybe
I think that's I think it's a piece of it. My view was that the fraud label was always a misframing of the debate. And I told Trump people from the get-go, don't take the bait on that reference. Because in the election contest challenge, you don't have to prove there was any fraud. You just have to prove somebody voted that either wasn't qualified to vote, their method of voting wasn't done in a qualified manner, or the count and the canvassing of the ballot wasn't done in a qualified manner, for which our remedy has always been either a revote or changing the election outcome. In the presidential context, the remedy has always been it goes to Congress to determine the winner, to vote in the House by state delegation. And so I always thought, because I thought you could have people who may have sincerely done what they did, in which no fraud occurred, but their vote still shouldn't have been counted legally. And so my history of this was in the nominating petition context, in which I represent a bunch of third parties, independent people across the spectrum, trying to get on the ballot. And I know what their signature match rules are. And on average, they strike 20 to 50% of signatures. Most of those signatures are people who actually signed. They just didn't meet the rules. And so my argument was, okay, we should have one set of standards, one set of rules, and apply them equally. And if you want to flood the system with mail-in ballots, okay, but we should strictly enforce the same signature match rules we have for nominating petitions. And they didn't. And that was my problem with the election. And my view was that was a state legislature passed rule. So in the presidential context, that's a constitutional rule that could not be set aside by the executive branch or anyone else. And that was my focus. So and there was tons of evidence of that. There was plenty of evidence that people voted who weren't qualified to vote for whatever reason. Sometimes they didn't register at their residence. Sometimes they were registered in other states. Sometimes it appeared they voted more than once. Maybe they didn't intend to, but that's what happened. Secondly, there was lots of evidence the signature matches didn't check. In Arizona, they actually did a court-ordered random sample, and the Democrats' own expert came in and said 10% of the signatures don't conclusively match. The court then changed the legal standard, said you had to prove forgery. Well, that's impossible because there's too few signature samples to make a forgery finding. The historical legal application by election bodies, including ones used by Democrats to keep Kanye off the ballot in Illinois, Virginia, and other states, was whether or not enough signatures conclusively matched. Democrats' own experts said at least 10% didn't, just in Arizona in that random sample. That's 30 times more than the margin of victory in the state of Arizona. My view is if they'd done a strict signature match check, they would have thrown out more ballots than the margin of victory in all these states. And then the best evidence for that is they were scared to ever do it. They still haven't. And then we have rules for how the vote is supposed to be canvassed and counted. In the canvassing, you're supposed to have party observers present to make sure the signatures match. And then the counting, you're supposed to make sure everything is done proper. What's the remedy? I mean, historically, what we've told other governments is if you don't follow these rules, the election outcome gets thrown out. We just decided we weren't going to apply the same rules we demand foreign governments apply to ourselves. And that was my view of the evidence. But it all got derailed by all the crazy stuff from Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood, and Mike Flynn is still on it, frankly. But all the Dominion, if you're going to commit a crime, you need a patsy. Dominion was a patsy. They were never to blame for what took place, but everybody got distracted by it. And so all of a sudden you're discussing, the ghost of Hugo Chavez.
Right. Well, and somebody did say in the chat also, and I don't know if it was specifically about your thoughts on the election. I'm guessing it may have been, but that they got banned from Twitter for the second time for posting one of your videos. So somebody wrote Locals is hosted by Amazon. I'm curious, are you concerned about that in the future? Because we saw what happened with Parler. Obviously, Locals doesn't yet have the same reputation, but we all at some point are at the mercy of the companies that make these devices. So where do we go from there?
Two things. People think that's the case because of how certain things look. I can tell you it's not the case. But for reasons that should belabor the obvious, Rubin doesn't publicize why the servers are independent and not dependent at all on Amazon.
Okay.
So it looks that risk is not present. The Locals has the best technology available. They would have functionally have to shut down the internet itself to shut down Locals. And now there's still limitations, but he has worked very, very hard to make it as decentralized as possible. Everybody that's on Locals owns their own. All of our creators own all of our own content. We're the sole moderators. So there's no centralized censor. There's no centralized store of information. There's no centralized person monetizing people's private information. There's no centralized source owning our own content. So it provides, and what I like about it, separate from being completely decentralized in that sense, is that it doesn't have any of the algorithmic manipulation. And so, I mean, you may be too young, but when I was growing up, I grew up on like Prodigy and AOL and old school message boards. That was great fun. Locals is recreating that, curating old school communities. It was funny. It was when people first joined it, people would tell me they felt like they weren't getting what they normally get from big tech. And I was like, that's because you don't realize how much you've been manipulated to be in a constant state of agitation and anger every 3 seconds. You don't realize they're bombarding you with certain post and visual images to keep you in a state of addiction and really social self-destruction. And what's also beautiful about Locals, it's like reading an old message board from the 90s where you had like-minded people getting together, sharing ideas, engaged in a civil conversation because we can ban the trolls. The other great utility is paying that tiny amount of money people pay a month. It turns out trolls won't do it. Trolls won't pay that and won't even pay $2 a month to troll somebody. I've told people if they want to troll me, they can pay $5 a month and I'll actually read their troll. But they got to go to vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
It's like you planned it because this guy, Bill, says, where's the best place to criticize your opinions? So.
Yes, you can come to vivabarneslaw.locals.com, troll me as much as you want, criticize it, and I'll actually read it. There's about 1,000 comments a day, about 200 posts a day on our Locals board. I'm getting increasingly, they're curating information for me. I don't have to go to Twitter or my other feeds to get the kind of content I'm looking that they're bringing to my attention, information that's not even anywhere in the normal court of public opinion. I think more and more people are going to do what you're doing, which is look for independent sources outside of the institutional gatekeepers, because there's such. I told these people years ago. Frontline did a piece on Alex Jones, and they interviewed me for 9 hours. Of course, they played like 60 seconds of the entire interview, which told me it was a very successful interview. Because if there was anything else in there they could have used against Jones, by golly, they would have played it. And they only put in the 60 seconds because they felt obligated, because I had done 9 hours of interviews with all those lights on under the thing. But when I told them is, if you want to know the success of Alex Jones, it's because of the institutional media. Watch as the institutional media declines. That's how more and more people seek out Alex Jones and all other independent sources. Jones depends on the media self-discrediting itself. You're obsessed with, why is he popular? Why is he successful? It's just because he reports things that you guys won't. Yeah. He tells people stories that they won't. And then when he turns out like, surprisingly right on some topic that people thought, no way is he right about that. People are like, wow. He's talking about Epstein 10 years before Epstein is a public name. So that's why. And it's the institutional media's constant self-discrediting is what's driving people to independent sources. But ultimately, that means getting off of the big social media platforms too, because I don't think they're going to let us stay. For example, VIVA's been one of the most neutral, like someone did an analysis of his Twitter feed, and it turns out he has exactly 50% left and right in what he tweets out, what he comments on, etc. But that didn't stop an independent organization that's basically a leftist organization doing a hit piece and smear piece on him and others, that if you simply mentioned the election issues, people were tagging him as a partisan right winger, which, if you watch Viva's like old school centrist guy. 20 years ago, he would have been described as liberal. And yet that's the mindset of where they're going to go. And if they're going to go after Steven Crowder, then they're going to go after everybody that has a dissident voice sooner or later.
A friend of mine who's still in the business was telling me about the woman who you probably have heard of, because I think she was making the rounds. Carrie, I can't think of her last name, but she was a Phoenix, Arizona anchor, and she quit and posted a video on Rumble about why she was quitting, and she didn't feel like she liked the job anymore, like she was telling the full truth and all that stuff. And my friend was like, and of course she posted on Rumble, because that's where all the really just crazy people go, and that's how somebody in mainstream news discredits the message by not I wanted to be like, well, yeah, but what about what she said? What about what she said about how y'all don't have the ability to tell the full truth, whether it's that you don't want to, or you don't have the time to understand what's really going on, or whatever the reason is. Like, debate the actual argument. Don't just say, and she went to Rumble. But they did the same thing with, so it's not just the person like the Alex Joneses of the world. It's also the sites themselves. And I feel like in my old world, there's probably a wide range of reasons why that kind of stuff happens. Maybe their feelings are hurt. Maybe there is that sense of superiority and old school. If you're not legacy or traditional, you're not in our club, and you're just not safe. I had a guy say to me once that they really believe in that gatekeeper idea, like that's a fail-safe, like we never got it wrong, we never get it wrong, like at least we have standards. There was a professor at UCLA who had this long Twitter thread about that. So that is a very common snobbishness, and maybe there's a lot of fear-mongering that goes in with it. But just like you said, if they would just debate the points instead of just turn their noses up and defame these people, maybe they wouldn't drive as much traffic to their sites, but they do it by not engaging with the arguments whatsoever. Now, they may say, because we're giving credence to crazy things if we do that. But if they were to do a little bit of research, they'd probably find out that a good majority of those talking points are worth discussing, and they're only crazy to them because they just aren't aware of them, because they're not consuming media outside their own country club group of news. So somebody else asked, can you guys talk about the SEC going after Library, the cryptocurrency? Am I saying that right? Is LYBR, that's Library?
Yeah, well,
right?
This is a function of the SEC going after Ripple was the first one. They're trying to treat cryptocurrencies as a security. I've had problems with the SEC for a while. To me, the SEC's goal and objective should have been, It actually relates to that lady in the Dale case in its own sense, the California version of that. To me, a security is what's sold on the public stock exchanges. The SEC never should have gone past that. I didn't think it would, or the state versions of this. Just because you're doing a private investment placement, that should not be subject to federal regulation. That shouldn't even be regulated by the state rules. You should have the regular tort law. If you breach a contract, you lie to someone, we have plenty of law to cover that. We don't need some agency. Government agencies are always looking for some victim that they can say this justifies our exercise of power and our arrogation of power. And it almost never turns out good, going back to that regulatory capture problem we discussed before. And so but it's particularly problematic here because what their goal is to fold up cryptocurrencies under SEC regulatory control so they can determine which ones get sold and which ones don't. And they can highlight all the different crypto scams that have occurred. There's plenty of those. I get all the offshore investment fraud news alerts of legal cases. And, once a week, there'll be some crypto scam unmasked in the Caymans or someplace else. So that's a legitimate problem, but we have legitimate legal means to remedy that. I don't think that it's a cryptocurrency period, or cryptocurrency is a security period. So I think their claims against Ripple, we'll see. Ripple is the test case. If they can succeed against Ripple, they're going to go after everybody. And anybody that's, is it a coincidence they're targeting people like Library and to some degree Odyssey solely that are dissident sources of dissident information? I mean, there's a lot of different cryptocurrencies they could target. Why are they targeting those in particular? So I disagree with the premise that they have a power. And judges, by the way, so far are pushing back. In some of the early Ripple hearings, that's one reason why I've been following that case, because of its long-term consequences to the entire blockchain, Bitcoin space, and cryptocurrency and digital currency space, is because of how that regulatory empowerment could kill a lot of alternative currencies. And there's many who believe that the goal of the government, the Fed, and the West is going to be the shift to a digital currency because digital currencies have such incredible control powers. I mean, imagine if you can turn off your ability to pay your rent, pay your bills, pay your car bill, be able to buy your food, be able to go to the doctor. All of a sudden, you can't do it because somebody on the government can hit a keystroke. That's what digital currency provides if it's government monopolized. And there's people who worry that's part of what's driving the SEC objective.
God, it just gets more and more sinister. Okay, well, Dave says my new news source, Barnes and Morrow Media, to go to alternative news sites, which used to be less alternative. Glenn Greenwald now, as you know, quit The Intercept that he started and now writes on his own. And I was just reading one of his articles on Substack where he was once again talking about the drive among some congressmen and women to label these, I don't even know what you would call these groups, but people commenting about election fraud or people who were talking about the Capitol riot as not just I don't know, dangerous people or so moving it not just from these guys are conspiracy theorists or they're spreading lies and disinformation, but to actually go the next step and start labeling people terrorist groups. And so your thoughts on that from the constitutional law perspective. I'm just curious because something I've heard a lot of people bring up is we had some movement in this direction, of course, after 9/11. It kind of went away for a little while. Then COVID, in some cases, has brought this back. And then we had January 6th. How does that end? Is that something that concerns you? Do you think that this is just something that we're all right now talking about because it's just the conversation of the moment because of what happened at the Capitol? Or do you think we start seeing new legislation? And how does that jive with the Constitution?
Well, for the national security state in the U.S., the Cold War was a gift. So they didn't have to worry about other pretext to monitor, surveil, spy, imprison, political dissidents in the United States. They could just stick the label communist on it. And that was enough for them to do whatever they wanted. With the end of the Cold War, they needed some other excuse. It wasn't long after that they started PACCON, which was an effort to infiltrate various militia groups across the United States. And some would say that they helped instigate some of the prominent notorious violence that took place in the mid-90s related to it. And the first Patriot Act was designed by this president when he was Senator Biden that was supposed to go in 1995 after the Oklahoma City bombing. And there was enough pushback that they backed down from it Then they waited until after 9/11, and as soon as 9/11 happened, boom, we get a rush of it. And they had then their excuse of domestic terrorism, international terrorism, do all this activity. But they're always going to escalate that and expand those labels. I've not liked a lot of the definitions we have of terrorism because they're too easily misused and abused. The old sedition statutes, I mean, those are, I've been arguing with my friends on the left. I was like, you don't want those sedition statutes to come back. Last time they really used them were anti-war leftists against people like Eugene B. Debs in 1918. These are bad statutes that should be buried. They target political speech almost inevitably. I mean, the first effort of it, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1800, were so controversial that Thomas Jefferson partially won running against them and gave mass amnesty to people afterwards. And they mostly died down until the Civil War reinstated a lot of those ideas. Then they ended World War I, but they mostly faded out. And then they used the Cold War to do their McCarthyite type tactics. But with the end of the Cold War, they were always going to look for some domestic threat, something scary and frightening to get people to capitulate to a wide range of invasions on their privacy and on their personal security in the name of national security. And they already have the domestic terrorism bill wrote. They tried to get it through last year. They planned on January 6th being the kind of event that would mobilize efforts to pass it. The problem is the narrative keeps falling apart. And from two different places. To their credit, a lot of great people on the left were suspicious right away. As soon as they saw the narrative be an out-of-place narrative, feel like the Russiagate narrative as it applied to January 6th, and they saw talk of this, Glenn Greenwald jumped into it. Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone jumped into it, also now on Substack. Michael Tracy, also now on Substack, started it. That's why you're seeing attacks on Substack, by the way. It's not a coincidence. All of a sudden, you see these independent left reporters, almost all on the left, very few on the right, and all of a sudden, Substack's a problem. We got to figure out who's supposed to be on here, who's not supposed to be on. Matt Iglesias, no problem. Glenn Greenwald, so forth. So, and then shows like The Gaggle that I always liked with Peter Lavelle and George Samueli always do great stuff. Independent perspective from an international perspective. Mostly, it's a hybrid of left-right. But the risk that Greenwald is identifying, and the reason why he's screaming about it is because he knows where this is going. From a guy who's been on the front lines of that investigative journalism for the better part of 20 years, the man who broke the Ed Snowden story. But the fact he had to leave The Intercept to actually be independent again tells you how bad institutional news on both the left and the right is. Your only good information is going to come from people on a Substack, at a locals, on their own channel.
I do think on some level it's been the double-edged sword of new media and social media, because on one hand, we can get information that perhaps we never could 30, 40 years ago when there were just a few options out there and they're all major corporations. On the other hand, it's given journalists an opportunity to shame each other in ways that I've never seen before. And also, I think that I really do believe a lot of that comes from a place of insecurity, almost like you're in 8th grade and somebody wears something different and everyone's like, look at that person. And you really don't want to make fun of them maybe, but you're like everybody else is, and you're just too much of a coward to stand up for that person. And I feel like in a lot of ways, obviously there could be more intention there, excuse me. But I think journalists are running scared in a lot of ways nowadays. They're scared of the mob. They're scared to stick their neck out on certain topics. They're scared to go against the grain, because you see the examples. They're like tarred and feathered in front of people on social media. When you stick your neck out, everybody comes for you, including the journalists, which 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to me, it was just unheard of to see journalists publicly shaming somebody for questioning a narrative. It just is it's weird to me. So, and now of course people look at Glenn Greenwald and they're like, he just comes after us all the time. What is he doing? Because now you see that happening on Twitter. Like, they're all the victims of Glenn Greenwald. He's just coming after everybody. But at some point, somebody has to stand up and say, you guys are creating some serious problems. And you're like, if you really care about journalism, and you're a journalist, at some point you have to speak up to your own people and say, like, enough is enough. And I really feel like that's what he's trying to do. But then, of course, now the next level is he's a bully. He won't leave us alone. How long has it been since Glenn Greenwald attacked me on Twitter? 24 hours. And, and just to see a guy like that being called a fascist when, like you said, he spent his entire career going after, way of running a government essentially and intelligence and all that stuff. So anyway, I want to switch topics real fast because I know you're going to go soon. I know people, you talked about this a little bit on your live stream on Sunday, but can we talk now that it's, Tuesday evening, your thoughts on the Derek Chauvin trial? Am I saying his name correctly? And any surprises so far for you, or how do you think it's going? And just, I don't know, give us your thoughts on that.
I was very surprised by how short opening statements were. The prosecution's opening statement was almost precisely what I thought it would be. They all based on appeal to emotion. That they would do a timeline. That they would use visuals. They would not only talk visually, but they would use visuals, which is critical. A very underrated aspect to doing effective presentation in the courtroom. They did the timeline, and here's a genius. Someone should take a look at the timeline. They managed to put one photo up 7 times in the same timeline. And what is it? It's Chauvin on Floyd's neck. It's over and over again. It was sort of subtly done and brilliantly done at the same time. So they hit their themes. They had a good line to start off with. It's a small badge, but it's a big responsibility, all that kind of stuff. I thought it would be a little bit more preacher style. They've hired a private lawyers to do almost all the work. This was an African-American lawyer, who's a very good civil rights lawyer. Thought he did a good presentation, but thought it'd be more theatrical than it turned out to be. But the more in the Johnny Cochran spirit. I think my view is a lot of black trial lawyers are better than your average trial lawyer because a lot of them have connections to the preacher tradition. And that means they understand rhetoric, they understand language, they understand persuasion a lot better. And the defense presentation, I thought part of what he did was good. He created these 4 categories of information. He said, here's how he's trying to filter the evidence at the store, the evidence inside the car, George Floyd's car, evidence inside the squad car, evidence at the hospital. And he clearly, I guess the goal was to de-escalate emotions. And he presented it almost like he was reading a police report. And it was trying to asceticize it, if you will. I don't favor that. My own view is that everything's emotional with a jury. Lawyers are taught that about evidence and law, and that what you persuade people with is evidence and law. Not really. You persuade people by appealing to some emotional part of the back of their brain. And he decided to skip that. And so I think he put himself behind the 8 ball. The other big mistake, lawyers really believe that jurors pay attention in trials. And that they think they wait till they see this evidence, and then they see this evidence, and then they'll be able to take it home in closing argument after the jury instructions. Not true. 80% of jurors make up their mind after opening statement by a wide range of surveys and studies that have been done, where they do full-scale mock juries, that they don't change their mind. Whatever they say after opening statement, they've done. Because what's going to happen is they're going to memory hole the evidence that doesn't fit their pre-narrative, and they'll highlight the evidence that they do remember. I had a case like that, where a juror loved me, thought, was very sympathetic, voted against me, but, was so sympathetic. She wanted to tell me why and how, and was very generous about that. And she's repeatedly asked, she said, I would have really loved this piece of evidence. And it was a piece of evidence I talked about 18 different times in the trial. Because something about the case psychologically put her in a different place, and I couldn't reach her with any evidence. So you win. Really, it's putting on a show. All the trial matters for is whether the evidence confirms or disconfirms certain beliefs that they had at the beginning of the trial. Jurors don't pay a great deal of attention. What they remember is very selective. And I thought he did a so-so job on the defense side of pre-filtering and pre-framing the case. So I'd say right now, if I was a betting man, 75% chance Chauvin gets convicted of at least a charge, and over 50% of one of the serious top 2 charges. Though I think the evidence increasingly, like the government's witnesses were kind of weak. They have a witness, they tried to speed up they actually tried to go slow on some of the video evidence, so you don't realize how bad the car is rocking when Floyd is inside the car. That they're going to get caught on that by the end of trial. Then they had a witness up that seemed sort of useless. And then I'll give them credit for emotions. They had a 9-year-old girl who happened to see it. It's like, why is her testimony even relevant to this point? What does she add to the equation other than emotional punch of, oh my goodness, I saw this man die in front of me and it was so sad. I was watching him die and da, 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 da. She's not a doctor. I mean, great emotional pitch. I mean, the prosecution's going to be pure emotion, top to bottom, pillar to post. And the defense is begging the jury to disregard emotion, which is not something commonly done. But then they put up a witness where the guy basically, he may have even been involved in riots against the police, claimed to be an MMA guy and claimed some stuff that I don't think was really right. Apparently was wearing a BLM t-shirt you could see underneath his shirt in front of the jury. If I was the prosecutor, I don't use that guy, or I save him for later. I limit his testimony because he makes the defense's point that they want you to be irrational. They want you to be emotional. They want you to be political. And I think on the evidence, there's a weak case, but so far it's gone the prosecution's way.
Okay, this takes us back to our previous decision. Thank you for all of that, by the way. That was extremely informative. Barnes, how did you know Q was a psyop? And this is from Linda. To that point, if you could also talk about the idea that there perhaps was this intentionally created narrative of both sides working on a coup to turn the other side towards them so that they wouldn't, like political magic, don't wash my hands and I'm going to do, so something else was going on behind the scenes there. And that was all a created narrative so that the right would say, see, they stole the election. And the left would say, see, they're trying to take over the government. And then they just continue fighting with each other when there's just something more nefarious going on. So could you talk about both of those things, the psyop part of that, and then what I was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, initially I didn't pay much attention to QAnon, even though I was getting sort of, emails from people asking about it. And I was like, no, there's nothing about this that sounds credible to me, until I saw the acceleration of disinformation coming through QAnon. That you don't have to, everything had a purpose. Don't say anything about what's happening to Flynn because that's secretly part of the plan. Don't say anything in advocacy for Julian Assange because he's really secretly safe hanging out with Elvis and JFK Jr., whomever. And more stories like this. And what they did very effectively was disable the grassroots populist support of a lot of Trump supporters, the people that would do grassroots journalism, crowdsource information gathering, getting information and stories and narratives outside of the institutional media. They did a brilliant job targeting that group. And so then I started paying a little more attention. Then I really started paying attention in the fall when it was clear they had got their hooks into the Flynn camp, Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood was clearly off the res, and that it was going to be a distraction to legal issues related to their issues that they were handling. And then when the third step was when they had them take public oaths and they recorded it. And I was like, hold on a second. So one, these people are telling everybody who they are by mapping themselves out as possible dissidents that are the crowdsourcing or willing to, exercise independent means of resistance, effective resistance. And now they're going to make sure everybody knows who they are by videotaping themselves and broadcasting it, taking one of these, oaths. And I was like, this is weird. There's something seriously going on here. A lot of my conspiracy friends on the left who are, into the conspiracy world, that's what they do. They were the ones screaming for like 2 years, saying that QAnon was a government psyop because it had certain traits. Namely, that the method that it was being used by Q for communication was unlike the other Anons on 4chan and 8chan and all the rest. It was using high pressure sales techniques. It was using prophetic religious components. It was using the sort of LARPing technologies, live action role playing capabilities. It was borrowing from all of these things. And of course, it would make sense. If you were in the intel world, why wouldn't you want to create particularly a digital informant, a digital infiltrator? And then what if you could combine artificial intelligence with that? It would be the perfect way of gathering information. You get people to rat themselves out, people to identify themselves, people to believe all kinds of crazy things that become useful for your purposes. My suspicion about QAnon being governmental at some level was just because the FBI put it on a watch list 2 years ago and managed never to find who it was. And knowing how they tracked that information, I found that improbable. So there was a whole bunch of the attributes of QAnon. I actually go into it in a hush hush episode on vivabarneslaw.locals.com, which is about the scope and scale of it. So I tracked it for those reasons. And because I think they're going to utilize it again. It's like whatever people think of QAnon, whatever people think about Trump or whatever, that technology, if I'm right, that's a powerful tool to reutilize. That the beauty of the digital world is you don't have to physically infiltrate anything anymore. It usually takes forever to physically infiltrate various organizations around the world. Now you can just do it on the interwebs. And you can have, to quote Nick Rekieta, and you can have, a pig farmer in the Philippines be your front guy for it. It was impressive what I think they got away with. And their ability to get people chanting for martial law and for overthrowing the government and for bringing, these are insane propositions. And then ultimately, I blame January 6th mostly on QAnon. Those people they really believe that the high, powerful people in the government, the white hats in the deep state, wanted them to go in that day. That's why you have someone that's a Army or Air Force veteran breaking in glass, thinking she's not going to get shot, that she's on the right and righteous side, and they're going to greet her when she gets inside and they lock up the bad guys. I mean, you can see the shock on her face, not just from being shot, but it's a completely cognitive dissonance. And if smart defense lawyers would start exploring that, because if I'm right that some degree of it was government infiltration, as it turned out the whole Whitmer kidnapping plot was, judge had to dismiss a bunch of charges, I think today or yesterday, because it turned out it was all an FBI entrapment operation, then that would be mighty, mighty interesting. But I think there's more to be dug up in the QAnon story, because I'm not buying that it's just some pig farmer in the Philippines who came up with it.
Okay, so can you settle a marriage dispute then? My husband loves smart technology. I was telling people before you got here that he comes home all the time with this you plug into the wall and then you can use your phone to turn it on or off, or he wears his iPhone to bed. And I'm the kind of person who turns the Wi-Fi off at night. Like after he goes to sleep and he doesn't know, I sneak out, I turn all the Wi-Fi off, and I put on my little tinfoil hat and I go to sleep and keep myself warm in it. And so I'm curious, do you think that I'm the better, am I doing better or him? Can you settle this dispute for us? And if it's me, can you tell him to stop bringing home all of these crazy things because I don't want Q to find out when we turn our lights on and off for dinner. That's my one issue.
Well, I mean, it's very much enemy of the state. That film is the world. And if you want to be able to operate independent of that world surveillance scope, you have to give up all the convenience and go Gene Hackman style from the movie. So it depends on how much the genius of the system is that they make things more and more convenient. It's really what YouTube is about. Why are most people on YouTube? It's more convenient. It's hard to have like 8 channels doing 8 things. No one wants to do that. I mean, that's I think ultimately the genius of locals. You can do videos there, podcasts there, Facebook kind of content, message boards. You can have all the great utility of social media without many of the burdens. But the genius of the whole system is that it says, here's this convenient little thing that's what the chip is going to be. It's going to be some convenient little thing. You won't need a passport anymore. You won't need a credit card anymore. You won't need to keep your medical records accessible anymore. They'll all be on a nice little chip that will be convenient for you. And they always use conveniency as the seduction to get in to have their control of what surveillance is.
And it's slowly normalized, so then people just go, I just figure I'm always being spied on, so who cares? Right? I hear that all the time.
Exactly.
I'm always being spied on, so who cares?
The fact that they're listening to you with that little voice all the time, that especially I had it in the movie room, and so Alexa would just go on randomly and say random things in response to the movie titles, and I was like, I got to get rid of this thing. This is too much. But it seems so convenient. You're like, I want to play music. Boom. Schedule something for me. Boom. The convenience is very seductive, but ultimately it's a trap if you want to stay out of the surveillance state.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question, but as you brought up earlier in the stream, starting April 1st, I am demonetizing all of my new uploads. You just eked in just before my beginning of my experiment, and I'm going to be doing exclusive content on locals, where you are as well, and I have your website in the description, but I should have also put your locals. So just everybody check the description, because I'll make sure that I put their locals URL there too, so you can check that out. But this question is going to be up for everybody that's in the live stream now, and I'll probably leave it up for, I don't know, maybe half a day or so. But I'm only going to put it on for locals and Patreon after this. So if you guys are not on locals or my Patreon page, go into the description, click on that, sign up. Locals, Robert can tell you has got a lot of really great creators, and it's free if you just want to consume content. You don't have to sign up to subscribe to anybody. If you want to comment and message and stuff like that, or post on people's pages, then you, like, ours is set. I know Eric Hunley and I have ours set at $2. It's pretty cheap. I get that, once you start supporting 100 people, it starts to get expensive after a while. So I understand. So it is free though if you just want to engage, just watch the stuff. If you want to engage with it, then you pay the $2. But just check out the description because it's got the links for everything there, and I'll make sure that Robert and Viva's locals page is there as well. But this question and the answer after this live stream in a few more hours is only going to be on those 2 sites. Robert, what I have found listening to you to be the greatest influence, or at least one of the greatest influences in who you are as a man today and the cases you take, was your father. I remember hearing you talk about him and some of the adversity that he suffered, that you watched as a child. And I found that to be really helpful in understanding how you see the world and the cases that you take on and all that. And that's one of my favorite things to learn about people is the little things that got them to where they are. I've talked before on my channel about how my parents used to take me to the hospital a lot when I was a little kid. They're both doctors, and I saw people dying at a very young age, and I didn't look at them and say, I want to be a doctor, I want to fix this. I looked at them and I said, what is the point of all this? Like, who are these people? What are their stories? What were they here to do? What were their loves and losses? And it was then that it hit me that life can't be about money or fame or all these things that we're often told that it's about, because we're all going to die. And the homeless person under a highway is going to end up just like Bill Gates. And that just can't be what it's all about. And I think that has driven me throughout my entire life, no matter who I was talking to or what I was doing, that we're all exactly the same. We're all going to end up exactly the same. And there's got to be some higher purpose to why we're all here, and just trying to understand, people from that perspective. So will you tell us about your father and how that's influenced you as a person and also as an attorney?